But so today I'm going to talk a little bit about, it's actually the RAIN project. Those are the results that we got from 2020 and 2021 growing season. So this would be this third year of study, which is our second year of data for winter crops. So my name is Luana. I am a PhD student here. I work for Dr. Lolato, and I'm taking care of the winter crops on the RAIN project. And as the title already give you a spoiler for you guys, adjusting nitrogen rate is the first step in nitrogen management intensification. So just a quick overview here. It's nothing new for you guys, but Kansas is the largest wheat producing state in the US. Just a little background, the winter wheat production in Kansas for the North and South Central areas, respectively, we have almost half of the part of those, this part of the state is still wheat monoculture, and around 44 to 30% is actually grown after soybeans. So I don't want to say that, but most of the times what we hear from farmers is that wheat is a more secondary crop now. It's not as primary as it used to be before. The reason for that is because now we are available to plant actual summer crops in the especially western part of the state. So the main reason when we ask farmers, why do you still plant wheat? They will say often because of the benefits that it brings to the rotation. So because of that, winter wheat is going to be as a second plant most of the time, not always, but most of the time for the farmers. And that would, the consequence of this is that winter wheat will probably be sown in some marginal conditions. So it's going to, especially when it's after a summer crop, we are going to sow wheat a little bit later, which is compared for the optimum for Kansas. And to understand the scenario of wheat here, we have a 50% of gap, yield gap on the state. The major reason for that is actually poor nitrogen management. But I also included here sowing date as one of the gaps because we saw in a recent review that we did with Lucas Munaro and Dr. Lolato, that sowing date was stated as the most important variable that affects winter wheat grain yield for the US central grape plants. So with all that in mind, the objective of the RAIN project is to evaluate, for the winter crop perspective, is to evaluate the effect of the improved nitrogen management and the interaction with common cropping sequences that we have for winter wheat here in Kansas. Another spoiler here in this picture, we can see on the left side, this picture was actually taken in March of last year, so early spring. On the left side of the picture, we can see that the wheat has a little bit of more biomass here. This was the wheat that was sowed at optimum planting date. And on the right side, we can see the winter wheat that was sowed late in November. So we can definitely see a visual difference here. At the early spring, when we are seeing the end of winter dormancy for wheat here, how that can be a set point for the wheat to start growing again. So we had 9 treatments as of last year. Again, the whole table that we had there had 17 treatments, but because some treatments are overlapping as of last year, we end up with 9 treatments, which was 9 combinations of 3 nitrogen management and 6 cropping sequences. We started the study in 2019, Ashland Bottoms in Kansas, and the data I'm going to show here is for the 2021 winter wheat growing season. So for the nitrogen management, we had in mind the 4R nutrient stewardship guidelines, which is the right rate, source, placement, and timing of fertilizer. And in this case, for our 3 nitrogen managements, we have the green nitrogen, which basically we didn't apply nitrogen at all in those spots. And the idea here is that we can count with the nitrogen that will be carried over by a legume crop that we are including in the rotation. So we are purposely including high nitrogen fixation legume crops in the rotation so we can have this carryover effect on winter wheat. And the other two nitrogen management is the standard and the progressive. I'm going to talk about them a little bit in details here. So those two nitrogen managements, they differ in all 4 aspects of management. So they differ in timing. So the standard, we have one single application at fixed 4, and the progressive management, we have the split nitrogen application. So the total N was actually split in 2 timings on winter wheat. It was at fixed 4 and fixed 7. They also differ in placement. The standard had a broadcast application, and the progressive had a streamer bar application, which is a more precise application next to the wheat row. They also differed in source, so they were both U and N. However, for the standard, we did not include any urease or nitrification inhibitor in the tank, while in the progressive treatment, we actually had both of those nitrogen inhibitors added to the tank as well. The total nitrogen rate also differed. We had 80 pounds per acre on the standard practice, and the progressive, we had actually a little bit less nitrogen in the second year. And as you guys know, the progressive, it's based on the in-season nitrogen recommendation, which comes from our crop modelers folks that provided the information for us of how much nitrogen we should apply on our second application. So in this case, we end up with 67 pounds per acre of nitrogen. So the first application was made with 40 pounds of nitrogen, and the second was 27 pounds of nitrogen. So this will result as 13 pounds of nitrogen less applied than compared to standard. So the only difference here besides the 4R difference from the both treatments is that the progressive had a little bit less nitrogen, which is actually the idea for the progressive treatment. We want to make the application more efficient, so the nitrogen is usually used more efficiently, so we can drop our rates a little bit. So for the 6 cropping sequences that we had the wheat, tappery, and dual purpose wheat. So that would be the treatment 16 from that big table that we have at the RAIN project. The second treatment is, the second cropping sequences is basically the same idea. However, instead of tappery, we included moth in the rotation. They are both legumes. And the idea of this treatment is actually do semi-intensive intensive forage production, and that's why we are using a dual purpose wheat here. That would be the treatment 17 on that table. We have the standard baseline, which is continuous wheat. We also have the fourth treatment. So just would like to highlight here, out of the 6 cropping sequences we had, 5 of them started with wheat in the first year. However, the only treatment that did not start with wheat was the 4th treatment, as I'm showing here, that started with triticale in the first year. And this triticale was actually made for hay. And then soybean for the summer crop, and wheat in the 3rd year. And the 5th cropping sequences was wheat, soybean, wheat. There we go. And the 6th crop sequences was the wheat and dual purpose cowpea and wheat. So this is just a summary of that combination that I mentioned before. This is not a factorial study, so we have different cropping systems in different nitrogen combinations. So for the tappery and moth rotations, for example, that I showed in the previous slide, the 1st and 2nd rotation, they only had green nitrogen management. Because of that, they were sold a little bit early. So they are early sowing date, mainly because of the dual purpose wheat. When we have the continuous wheat and the triticale soybean wheat, we have both nitrogen management, standard and progressive, and they were both sold at optimal planting date. Again, sowing date here, it's not actually a treatment, but I'm showing here in this table just to make it easier later for the results, but is a consequence of the crop sequence. So wheat after soybean also had standard and progressive. This wheat here was planted late in the season because the soybean was not harvested until November, which is different from this one because we harvest triticale for hay. This soybean was able to be planted a little bit earlier in May. And then by the time of the optimum planting date of wheat, the soybean was already harvested. However, this soybean here was double cropped from after wheat. So we didn't have a window to sow this soybean earlier. So soybean was planted a little bit later, and then winter wheat was also planted a little bit later. And the same thing for the forage dual purpose cowpea and wheat. So this one only had progressive treatment and was also sold at late. This is just a quick overview of some management that we had in the field. The soil type for Ashland is Roxbury series. We applied the starter fertilizer in all the crops, including the green nitrogen management. However, as you guys know, it's just DAP, so it's a mainly starter fertilizer. We have some information on initial soil fertility as of 2019. And winter wheat, the variety that we planted was Zenda. We did increase the rate of planting when we plant earlier or when we planted later. So we increased a little bit to 120 pounds per acre as compared to 90 pounds per acre for the optimum, which is what is recommended as a common practice here. The weather data we collect from the Kansas Mesonet, and the data that we collected, it was the biomass, and we collected a 1 meter row. We partitioned this biomass into stover, head, chaff, and grain. We ground each part of those parts of the plant, of course, after trashing. And then we sent to the lab for carbon and nitrogen concentration analysis. So the experimental design and data analysis, we had an RCBD with the 4 replications. I treated the treatments and the blocks as fixed, and I subject them to a type 3 analysis of variance in arm. I used Tilke for mean separation, and the plant nitrogen concentration was made using a combustion analyzer. And we calculate the nitrogen uptake in each part of the plant by estimating the sum of the product between the average weight and the nitrogen concentration that we got from the lab results. So another thing that we calculated here too was the nitrogen nutrition index. This is an important tool that we do when we are talking about nitrogen, mainly because one thing that influences a lot the nitrogen uptake in plants is the amount of biomass that the plant produces. So we calculate the nitrogen nutrition index because it is an index that we can calculate the status of nitrogen in the plant regarding the regarding the biomass production. So we can actually compare apples to apples. And we calculated by measuring the actual nitrogen concentration that we got from the lab versus the nitrogen concentration that we had, the critical nitrogen concentration that is based on previous literature, which in this case, we used the Justice from 1994. And this is the formula that we did to calculate the critical nitrogen concentration. So jump to the results. Real quick, the weather conditions here, we can see that regarding the planting date, the winter wheat was in a water deficit for the growing season. So in the green bars, we can see the normal precipitation during the winter wheat growing season. The blue bars show the actual precipitation we have during that growing season. And the orange bar shows our evapotranspiration. The gray bar shows actually the difference between the actual precipitation we had and evapotranspiration. So as we can see, regarding the planting date, we do have a little bit of less than 1 ratio between the evapotranspiration and actual precipitation here. So it was a drier year than the average. So the yield, we have here in green bar, the green nitrogen. the orange bar will have the standard nitrogen management, and the blue bar will have the progressive management. In the x-axis, we can see here the actual crop sequences, and on the y-axis, we see the yield. As we can see here, the yield did not differ within cropping sequence in terms of nitrogen. So as we can see here as an example, continuous wheat, they both have the same similar yield production. However, the trend that we can definitely notice here from this graphic is that the yield was highly determined by the planting date. So as we can see here, optimal planting date, most of the time, actually all the time, had better yield than late and early. But I need to highlight here that the early planting date, though, I wouldn't say that this low yield would come from early, but here we have a green nitrogen management, so we did not apply nitrogen in those plots at all. We have the tapery and moth and are established for those two crops, and those the previous year before winter wheat was not very good. So I don't know how much nitrogen those crops actually left as a carryover for winter wheat. And we also did a dual purpose wheat here. So we could not stress the plant more than we did. So I don't know how realistic this is as for early planting date, but definitely this treatment was the one that had the lowest yield. And here is just two other graphics that we have for nitrogen uptake and also biomass, showing the same thing on the x-axis. And the only thing I want to show here for you guys is that, basically nitrogen uptake and biomass had the same trend. So we have almost identical graphics here as compared to yield, which can show to us how correlated those things are: biomass, nitrogen uptake, and consequently yield. So they differ just a little bit, but maybe in statistical results, but when we see the overall trend for them, it's basically the same. Now going here for the protein, we can see that our protein levels were not that good that year. We have a few treatments that passed 9.5% of protein in the grain. And as we can see, interesting here, showing again the yield graphic that I showed previously, how we have this shift from protein and yield. As we know from literature, we also always, most of the time, we find negative correlation between yield and protein, and that's basically what we are seeing here, except for a few treatments like continuous wheat for both nitrogen management. But other than that, we do see this shift. Now, for biomass production, in those graphics here, I only divided by planting date in the top graph and nitrogen management in the bottom graphic here. So we can see that the shoot biomass for planting date, we can see that optimal, highlighted by the orange line here, we can see that had a little bit better biomass production as compared to late and especially early. And also for nitrogen management here, we can see on the blue line that the standard did produce a little bit more biomass as compared to the progressive. On the right picture here, we can see for both cropping sequences, they're both standard nitrogen management, but we can definitely see here a translation from the top graphic here that the optimum planting date did have a greater biomass as compared to a late planting date, which is exactly what this graphic here is showing to us. Now, just a quick overview here for the nitrogen update. We can see again that should biomass and nitrogen uptake, we have almost identical graphics for both planting date and nitrogen management. So we again, evidencing for us how much correlated those variables are. I promise I'm almost done. So for shoot nitrogen concentration, again, so now we are compared to the critical curve that we have in literature from Justice, which is the yellow line here. So we can see that all treatments, green nitrogen, standard and progressive, they were all below this critical curve here. So that can indicate us that the winter wheat might be in some stress although we also need to consider that what we have available in literature was done in 1994, and also it was in a very good water environment that they did this. I don't know how realistic it is to actually compare to ours. We had other studies that we did in Kansas that we also have the same trend of having a below critical nitrogen concentration in the shoot biomass. So in the bottom here, same thing for planting date. We can see optimal planting date also having a little bit better shoot nitrogen concentration. Is not during the entire growing season, but most of the part here. We do see the late had a little pop up in shoot nitrogen concentration later in the season here, but I don't know like how much these 2 points here can actually tell us nitrogen concentration for the late planting date. Again, pictures tell us a lot. So in this picture here, we can see on the left side, the winter wheat that was sowed late, 120 pounds per acre, that seeding rate, progressive nitrogen management, however, was sowed late because it was after soybean here. And we can see on the right side, the wheat that was planted at optimum planting date, 90 pounds per acre, standard nitrogen management, and under continuous crop. We can see the denser canopy cover and denser heads that we have here as compared to the left side. And just to make it official, our nitrogen nutrition index, we can see that regardless the nitrogen management and planting date, the nitrogen nutrition index below 1 indicate that our nitrogen is below average for our crop. When we have around 1, this is a good indicator. This means that our crop is receiving the nitrogen that it needs. And when we have this above the 1 line here, it means that we are in a luxury consumption. So either for planting date or nitrogen management, we see stress in nitrogen for the plants during the entire season, even for semi-ligation or anthesis. We do see a little bit higher for standard here, which might be for that extra 13 pounds of nitrogen we applied. We don't know, we need more years analyzing this so we can actually answer this question, but just another overview here, now considering the whole cropping sequences here, same idea. Nitrogen was limiting factor for us in that year. And we can have a clue that because whenever we have the little extra 13 pounds more, this already was enough to bump this a little bit up as compared to the progressive nitrogen management. Conclusions. So the application of the 4R nutrient guidelines, it is good, but as of this year, the results, we see that there are components within the 4R that still play a major role. In this case, it was the nitrogen rate. So the 13 pounds of nitrogen extra that we had was able to boost a little bit the nitrogen nutrition index on the crop for us. The grain yield was dictated not by intensified nitrogen application, but by the SCARET's research, which is the case was the total nitrogen applied. And nitrogen management intensification should be applied only when nitrogen rate is appropriate. And again, sowing date still plays a big role on determining wheat yields, and nitrogen management still need to be investigated to shorten the gap for those cropping sequences. Another thing I would like to highlight here, as I showed by the weather conditions, as we had a drier year, this might also have influenced the progressive nitrogen management. So we probably didn't have the ideal scenario for nitrogen volatilization because of the drier year. So maybe the nitrogen inhibitor that we applied together in the progressive nitrogen management, maybe that was not good for a drier year, but maybe if we had a wetter year, maybe that would provide us a different results, even though we applied more nitrogen in the standard practices. And with that, I would like to thank all my group and everybody that has been with me in this journal. And I'm open for any question you guys have.